What screams, I'm poor but pretending to be rich? A base model luxury car, like a BMW 220i or 320i, an MBCLA, an Audi base level A3 or A4, etc. They will go around touting, I drive a BMW, but they likely have it on lease and are overpaying for what the car provides, and they're paying out for insurance. At least twice a week, I have someone on the phone unable to understand why the quoted premium for their BMW is almost 50% higher than the quote for the other cars in their household. It's because not only are BMWs expensive to repair, but statistically, BMW drivers are reckless on the road. I mean, the 20i engine is what, 180 horsepower? But it has the badge of BMW, and they bank on the fact that most people don't know cars that well, so they can pretend to be fancy. Now, this isn't everyone who drives those cars. Some people just like the styling of the car but didn't want to pay real luxury car prices, so they got the cheapest model they could. But those are rare because most of them can get a much better deal with a Toyota Camry. And people who actually like BMW as a car company, actual car enthusiasts, would rather get a used 35 engine at least. Where I live, you see a lot of these base model leases driving around. It makes you chuckle. It's always driven by the same guy too. The guy who has an air of, I'll be your boss soon enough, but he looks like he's barely recovered from his weekend of partying as he drives to his cubicle. Story 2. Going out for a big fancy meal to a nice restaurant and dressed to the nines, but you show up an hour and a half late, order the cheapest stuff on the menu, complain that the soda is flat in the hopes that it'll be calmed, refuse to drink anything because it's expensive, take 45 minutes to figure out the bill because the restaurant can't split checks and you've got to dig in your bag for that extra $10 bill, have several cards decline and then not tip. And all throughout the night, being more interested in taking pictures in the beautiful restaurant to post on Instagram and pretend that you live like this all the time than enjoying the actual food. This happens at my workplace every single weekend. We started putting the gratuity on any tables that fulfilled a certain checklist because we knew we'd get screwed otherwise. For real, I once served a table like this where the girl's card was declined. When I brought it back to tell her what had happened, she already knew because the bank texted her. She was only then moving money from savings into checking on her phone, and I happened to see over her shoulder that she had $38 in checking. Who the hell goes out to a Manhattan steakhouse with $38 in the bank? Story 3. How Dominican families fight tooth and nail to give their kids Nike or Adidas before they can even walk. I work with someone who's married to a Dominican, and they're constantly in tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt because both of them need to have the latest everything. It's constant photos and social media of the whole family, new clothes, and the latest gadgets. And then she cries at work about not being able to afford the mortgage sometimes. I just don't get it. The reason I included the cultural aspect is also because this colleague tells me they send money to the DR all the time so that other families can buy stuff too. Then I always ask, why not send money for education and maybe investing? But I'm always told that the money is used for designer clothes and shoes most of the time, being seen in expensive clothes. In a fancy car at a hip restaurant is the goal of Dominican socialites. It doesn't matter if you have money or not. I've seen people drive Porsche Cayenne SUVs but then live with their parents. Also, people send money back home for 2 reasons. The family needs it or they're flexing. The dollar, or any currency to be honest, has more purchasing power over there. Story 4. My partner is a financial service manager at a car dealership. Her job, in a nutshell, is to submit your credit card application to the banks to get financing for your car. Your credit score will affect your car's interest rate and which bank and what amount a bank is willing to lend you. I feel like the world's biggest equalizer is when your Equifax report opens on a computer screen. I know this is obvious to people like us on PFC, but it isn't obvious to the majority of people who will walk through a dealership trying to buy their dream car. A customer came in wanting to purchase a used 2012 Acura sedan. It was dressed to the nines with a big Louis Vuitton belt, leather shoes, a sweater cardigan, a fresh haircut, you name it. The customer was in their late 20s and had to get their near-retired mother to co-sign for the car. My partner was wearing a belt from a luxury brand, and the customer commented on how that belt didn't look like it cost much and he could buy one of those. I have more stories from her experience, but they don't fit the topic of the conversation. But I will say this. You won't believe how many people's credit scores are less than 650. Some families don't own their house in their rich neighborhood. They rent it. They lease their luxury cars and live paycheck to paycheck with no savings whatsoever. Their credit score is ruined because they can be slightly delinquent on these items, but they won't get into collections or repossession territories, so only their credit score is impacted. They typically come from immigrant backgrounds where face is a huge deal. Story 5. The cousins, technically my cousin and his wife, had a nice house, a brand new workshop garage, and a used but $40,000 camping trailer. They then moved to a brand new home before selling their old place. Both had next to new 1-year-old vehicles. I thought, wow, especially when she quit her job to do an MLM. They had 2 kids by then, so it made sense for her to stay home rather than pay for daycare for 2 kids, which here is more than $2,000 a month. I presumed she made a ton at her office job and he cleaned up as a drywaller. Tons of work for him in our city. Later, I came to know that one of their parents had to buy their original house when it didn't sell so that my cousins could have a mortgage in the new house. The parents are now landlords of a house halfway across the city, and the trailer money all came from my grandmother. I believe it was or is a loan rather than a gift, but I can't believe they went to the 80-something old lady for cash. I presume their vehicles were on long-term loans as well. That much unnecessary debt makes me feel ill. Sure, I'd love a new car over my 12-year-old one, but my car still runs just fine. That's $400 to $800 a month saved. A new house or renovating mine would be heaven, but my house is safe, fairly spacious for a size family, and while not pretty or updated, isn't ugly. I don't even know how much I saved per month, and while I can see a trailer being important to them because as a family they camp every weekend, I'm pretty sure there's one cheaper than $40,000. Story 6. I live in a region with a huge mining industry. Miners get paid really well with almost no expertise needed, and they get huge production bonuses. I've seen this exact situation more times than I can count. A 20-year-old guy started mining. With overtime and a bonus, he gets $120,000 or $150,000 a year. So he drinks and parties, paying a $500 bar tab every weekend. He gets a girlfriend and he buys a house. She gets pregnant, so he pays for a huge wedding. Not long after, she gets pregnant again, so he gets a bigger house. Then he keeps getting money, so he buys a huge pickup truck, a smaller car for the wife, an ATV, a snowmobile, and a boat. He trades those in for newer models every few years. All of this while paying the minimum payment and everything, so it takes forever to actually own any asset. His children go to school, so he complains a bit. I didn't go to school and make good money, but pays for their college and university. Around 55 years old, he gets into a small accident or develops a condition that prevents him from working, so he starts getting disability pay. Since he barely finished high school, if at all, he has trouble getting other work, so he starts selling his toys one by one. He ended up retiring very poor because he never put much money to the side as he was always neck deep in payment. Sometimes, if the metal price dips, mines close down, and some guys even go into bankruptcy because they have to default on so many loans. All that despite a great salary in a region with a very low cost of living. Story 7. That's easy. I'd say credit cards. I've known people who order food for delivery almost every day and buy new electronics constantly. They also tend to be the types who say they don't have money, but then the next day there's another skip the dishes bag at the door. Someone told me their minimum payment for the credit card, and I had to stop myself from saying, "What?" out loud. I recently looked at some average consumer debt statistics, and the amount was mind-boggling to me. But it's so normalized. I have several friends who actually don't have credit cards or any sort of access to a credit line because they know that if they got carried away, they could never pay it back. Hell, I know people who make good money who will never pay back their cards as long as they continue the lifestyle they're living. The thing is, that's normal. All around me, I'll hear things like, "I'm waiting for X until I finish paying off my line of credit." Or they'll tell me they paid off their credit, but 5 months later they're over-leveraged again. It's so accepted in Canadian society to just be in debt. I know a lot of people making minimum payments or using RAP in their student loans because I guess the loan will be forgiven after 10 or 15 years. Some of those people make more than I did when I started paying off my student loans. I know people who are anxious when they get laid off because their line of credit's monthly interest is high enough that they need income to keep paying for it, and so on and so forth. At the end, it's not really worth looking at and gloating over someone else's situation, even though who doesn't like feeling like they're more responsible, sometimes. Just know your goals and don't let yourself get carried away. Many people who are seemingly living a better life than you are also mired in debt, and not all of them are happy about that. Some deal with chronic unhappiness or depression, so they spend money to make the pain go away. It doesn't work. You can't fill a hole in your heart by throwing money at it, but they sure do try. I've known a lot of people like that. Since we're halfway through and you're obviously enjoying the content so far, hit that like button and subscribe for more flexing gone wrong stories. Story 8. I'm not entirely sure if this belongs here, but here goes. I work as a host in a small restaurant with average prices, $10 to $15 a plate, plus drinks, etc. Yesterday, 2 middle-aged women with generic Karen haircuts pulled up in new Mercedes, came in and immediately became outraged that we had a waiting list due to being understaffed in the middle of a lunch rush. I offered to put them on the list, and one of them pulled out her credit card, showed it to me, and assertively said, "Okay, are you going to seat us now?" I assumed that she had one of those limitless cards, which I literally couldn't care less about, and told her that it didn't matter, and she'd just have to wait. They went and stood outside, even though we had set up chairs so people could sit where they waited, and glared at me the entire time. They kept coming in and asking why I couldn't seat them, which I answered with the truthful answer of being terribly understaffed, as 2 servers and a cook had been injured in a car accident that morning. They're fine, no major injuries, but the car was totaled. Eventually, after a 20-minute wait, I call them and seat them on the patio. They proceed to order about $80 worth of food and drinks, going so far as to pour their first round of Bloody Marys onto the ground just to prove the unfortunate people around them that they didn't care about the cost of their food. Then, when they were given their bill, they waited until the server went back inside, then ran out of the patio gate, hopped in their car, and drove away without paying. Unfortunately for them, Karen had decided to back into her parking space out front, with her license plate clearly visible to the outside security camera. A police report was then immediately filed by my manager. It was a good day. Story 9. I used to sell cars at a premium automaker's dealership. One day, a middle-aged couple arrived for their scheduled appointment. The wife, twirling her Mercedes keys, entered with an air of disdain, while the husband was notably pleasant. As we discussed options for the car they were interested in, the wife's behavior grew increasingly disrespectful. After a brief exchange, I opted out of accompanying them on the test drive, delegating it to a colleague. While my colleague was out with them, I took the opportunity to inspect their trade-in Mercedes. It turned out to be a base model CLA in surprisingly poor condition, cluttered with garbage and makeup accessories. Notably, it had a salvage title due to a recent serious accident. Following the test drive, my colleague explained that wholesalers refused the trade-in due to its salvage title. When the husband called to discuss the matter, he was understanding, admitting that it was his wife's idea to conceal the car's history. Despite this, the wife continued to berate my colleague over the phone, boasting about her Mercedes and threatening to buy another. In the end, the husband apologized for his wife's behavior and expressed genuine interest in our car once his lease expired. In my experience, I've learned that wealth isn't always flaunted. Those who do often have something to hide. Genuine buyers come from all walks of life, regardless of what they drive or wear. Story 10. Buying a house you can't afford makes you look good to other people. People that owned our current house bought it 2 years ago before listing it and couldn't sell it for another year. So I was trying to figure out why they were trying to sell it so soon after buying it and why they couldn't sell it for a whole year. I found the wife's Facebook and tried to find some posts indicating that they dealt with major house damage, some awful neighbors, or something that would explain it. And then I found it. A 3-year-old post about finding her dream home and how the Raps bought it. They bought a house they couldn't afford so they could look successful in their pyramid scheme, hoping that would make them successful so they could eventually afford it, but that didn't work out. I checked her Facebook a week or so after closing. They bought a foreclosed fix-me-up home. Good for them, right? She shared that in a big post about how she bought the big house because she thought it was her dream home, but soon realized they're just walls and decided to downsize so they could spend more time outside, somehow thinking it works in the process. I checked on her more recently. She made a post saying she's been lying to herself and was hoping it works. Apparently, it never did. Story 11. I don't know if this counts, but I used to live in the ghetto, like a really bad apartment complex and neighborhood, and I found it hilarious when people would come out walking around with the newest iPhones, expensive shoes, and expensive clothes, but they would live in the smallest apartments with like 2 to 3 people sharing a room. I mean, these apartments had 3 bedrooms at the most, yet a lot of these types of people had families like 5 to 9 in one apartment. We got out a long time ago, but I've seen and known of people who still live there to this day. I left like 8 to 9 years ago and now own land in our own home. We never spent more than we could and probably looked a bit ordinary or whatever, but we were happy. And now own our own business and are very successful. I feel bad for them. I don't think they were ever taught to save their own money and not waste it the moment you get it. Frequently, there were people who had very nice cars but couldn't pay their rent. Women who would always come in with a sob story about how they couldn't pay all the rent but had expensive purses and jewelry. There were guys who sold substances and we couldn't kick them out because they always paid the rent. Until one day they got locked up. Once there was a guy with an entire apartment full of expensive electronics but no money to pay rent. There was also a guy who went to the casino every day. Once, a guy who made $50,000 a year begged me for an apartment. Since it was a low-income building, he didn't qualify. He had filed for bankruptcy multiple times in his life, had his car repossessed several times, and couldn't get an apartment anywhere because he ruined his credit. Story 12. I see this a lot with my circle of acquaintances, but I only know the reasons behind one of them. He makes about $80,000 or something a year, but he also owns a swanky condo in downtown Toronto and a boat. His parents paid his down payment. I think he's paying the mortgage, but his parents are paying like 10% of that too. He went half on the boat with his sister. The boat was bought used for $22,000. The whole family only uses it once every 2 weeks or so in the on-season, so he has it for the rest. It makes it look like he's constantly boating and that it's his boat. The people in my circle of acquaintances who have houses in Toronto, I'm 28, all come from upper-middle-class families. I wouldn't be surprised if they all got help from their families. Oh, another one is a guy who doesn't necessarily flaunt his wealth, but just always seems to have money. He's going on trips all the time, posting nice photos, etc. Most recently, he went on a long backpacking trip with a nicely outfitted Sprinter van. Those things aren't cheap. He's a friend of mine, but I'm not close enough with him to ask how he makes his money because I've never known him to be employed. Like, at all. I asked a mutual friend of ours what the deal was when I saw his #van posts. It turns out he straight up lives off of his parents' cash. They seem to be totally fine with it. So this is a guy who will never have to work a day in his life. He's not a flaunter necessarily. He doesn't buy cars or houses or anything like that. So I sincerely think that even when his parents are gone and he gets the inheritance, he'll keep doing what he's doing. Story 13. I know someone who basically mooches off of her rich parents. She sees herself as an amazing entrepreneur and has a business in coaching people for things she's utterly unqualified to coach. It began as teaching entrepreneurs how to outsource and reclaim their time. And when that fell flat, she rebranded herself as a more generic life coach. Whenever her friends ask what she's up to, she'll say she's busy with work, but she's super vague about that, and no one is entirely sure what exactly she does. She spends all day posting photos from spas or day trips and flaunting her Chanel, LV, or Mercedes in thinly veiled #girlboss posts. She makes the occasional post about attending some coaching or entrepreneur conference. Most recently, she's moved to Mexico, but as far as anyone can tell, she's done nothing but stay at a resort. As all her photos are of a pool or a fancy restaurant, I think she's so accustomed to using her parents' money as a crutch that she can't stop. There's no other way she can afford her lifestyle, but she'll continue to flaunt her brave, self-made woman image all over social media, and anyone who calls her out on it is now just another hater. Story 14. My aunt was what we call Mountain William. It's a term for a hillbilly, which we are to a degree, who has had a taste of the finer life and wants everyone to think they're rich and in high society. I loved her to death. She was and is my favorite aunt. She was the sweetest, most generous woman I might ever meet. But her home had an air of falseness about it that shaped my view of people well into adulthood. She loved crystals. Bowls, lamps, and chandeliers in every room are made of crystal or fake crystal. Baskets that were supposed to mimic wicker, but were woven with fake gold wire with crystals embedded aesthetically. She had fancy-looking furniture and was probably expensive, but the fact that her massage chair was probably the most expensive thing in her whole house just enhanced the fake richness of the whole thing. Don't get me wrong, her home is beautiful, and as a kid, I was so afraid to touch anything because it looked so nice. But it also just felt fake. So to me, surrounding yourself with grandiosity like that feels fake. Story 15. I work with a guy who makes around $180,000 per year. Since moving to the area, he's purchased a $500,000 house, spent $100,000 on renos, $125,000 in a boat, $70,000 on an SUV that's not even powerful enough to tow the boat, so he rents a truck to move it. Spent $30,000 in a Sea-Doo, $30,000 in a hot tub, and $20,000 in a sauna. All this spending has occurred in less than 3 years. So you might be asking, how do I know all of this? He brags about it. In fact, the guy doesn't shut up, so everything mentioned is right from his mouth. Furthermore, he's divorced and pays thousands a month in child support. He has no investments, no savings, and everything is on payments. He had to borrow money for the down payment in his house from his dad. The knock-on effect this had with others at work has been beneficial, as none of us dare look as dumb and irresponsible as this to our peers. So that wraps up our I'm poor but pretending to be rich real-life stories. If you found these eye-opening, be sure to check out this next video. What are rich people problems you've seen? Story 2 is something to look forward to. See you there.